one thing led to another. I started to source potent forms of concentrates for my mother, and they became some of my earlier clients. And we drove fully headlong into the cannabis industry, helping open up some of the first dispensaries in Denver, and then ultimately several other states. To your point, I kind of have a little ambition and a little bit of a drive to build things. And when I saw the opportunity based on that set of facts and based on that personal story, we went for it. And the rest is history.
Dotting I's and crossing T's. Like any other industry, cannabis can't escape the need for rules and regulations, whether that's in how businesses operate in the market or with one another. Bob Hoban is the co-chair of the Cannabis Industry Group at Clark Hill Law Firm, and he knows a thing or two about the letter of the law, so we sat down with him to see if we could get up to speed. And hello and welcome back to the Lobsterpot podcast. I'm Dave Barton, founder and co-host of this show and the founder of Thermidor, a cannabis content creation agency. And I'm going to stop talking and introduce you to Jamie, who is Jamie Bonthron, who is also the co-founder of this podcast and this company, which you can see right here. It looks backwards on my hat, but it looks forwards on your hat. Why is that?
That's not a question for me. 4 p.m. on a Tuesday, we're definitely in a certain zone, aren't we, Dave?
I think so.
We're pulling through, and we are joined by an excellent guest today. So I'm looking forward to this one.
He is, and we see him here, we see him there. He's at every single event I think we've probably been to, and then some. He is the co-chair of the Cannabis Industry Group at Clark Hill Law Firm, based in Denver, Colorado, USA. He is Mr. Bob Hoban. Welcome, Bob. Great to see you, sir. Thanks for taking the time.
Dave and Jamie, thanks for having me. It's good to be here, and it's good to be talking to you. And before we get started, I do just want to say how I do love the name of the podcast and the name of your group. It really sticks and stays. So good work there.
Well, we should doff our cap to you, sir, and thank you very much. So, I mean, lots of people know you. You are very well known within the sector. But for those that don't, do you want to just give us a little brief intro to Bob and what Bob's about, and we'll kind of go from there.
Yeah, 100%. So I'm a lawyer by training, but I've served as a interim executive officer for a number of my clients over the years. I've started and sold my own businesses. I've taught cannabis policy at the University of Denver. Done a lot of things in the space. Right now, the bulk of my days are spent working with Clark Hill. Working across the country. It's an international law firm and around the world on cannabis transactions, and helping our clients grow, helping other clients from other places around the world come into the United States, helping develop best practices and policies for international transactions. So that's a lot of the things that I focus on. I also likewise host a podcast, the Hoban Minute, for since 2020. Which is something fun that we do, and it's a good industry to be in part because of the challenges, and in part because of the fact that it's so new that it needs to be stabilized, but also you meet the greatest people in the world, because if you took, and you've been to these conferences, if you took the profile of all these people in one room. What were the chances that they'd all ever get together on anything? Because they come from so many different walks of life. The fact that we get to work in this diverse industry is pretty exciting.
100%. And I think you're right. It's I've always thought of the sector as almost like it's 15 different sort of industries coming together, sort of smashing into each other and going, okay, so how do we figure this out, really?
Yes.
Which is quite interesting. But how did you kind of get into the sort of cannabis sector? I mean, as a lawyer, was it kind of a natural segue in terms of what you're interested in, or was it a kind of, I see a kind of opportunity that's interesting, as you sort of said, or how did it sort of come about?
A little bit of both, but it's really more of a personal story. So I was a commercial litigator. I tried cases for many years for large companies, ultimately transitioned into really just transactional corporate law. And, my mother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And pancreatic cancer is one of those ones that kind of sneaks up on you, and there's not great treatment options. So by the time she was diagnosed with cancer, it started with back pain. Some people have lower back pain. They don't really understand why now than they were years ago. But it's hard to sort of diagnose that as cancer. At least it was at the time. So she was told she had 6 months to live. During that period of time, we spent an even greater amount of time together. My job was to sort of chart the pills and make sure she was taking the regimen that the physicians recommended. Now, what I learned one morning was when she was taking the pills to her mouth, I saw sort of drool come out, like saliva. In other words, her body needed the medicine so badly, but it was almost a no-win game, meaning she took the pills to feel better, but it only lasted for a certain period of time, or she couldn't take the pills because her stomach didn't feel very good. So not knowing what I know now, but knowing what I knew then, I knew that, of course, cannabis could help with nausea and just, ease the pain a little bit on the stomach in the morning. And that's kind of how we started. And that one thing led to another. I started to source potent forms of concentrates for my mother. And they became some of my earlier clients. And we drove fully headlong into the cannabis industry, helping open up some of the first dispensaries in Denver, and then ultimately several other states. To your point, I kind of have a little ambition and a little bit of a drive to build things. And when I saw the opportunity based on that set of facts and based on that personal story, we went for it, and the rest is history. The Hoban Law Group, but my firm before I sold it in July of 2021, was around for 13 years. All it did was cannabis industry commercial work, and we had 52 lawyers spread out across 6 or 7 different countries. So it was exciting.
No, very cool, and thank you for sharing that. It's always encouraging, and people always have personal stories, and again, there are so many different sort of motivations, but I think those are the most authentic when it's like, someone it's really helped them and the quality of life. And again, it's almost when you see that kind of purpose and it's brought into something sort of more into a career, it definitely becomes a passion that you can drive forward. It's like, I've seen this work, I know it works, let's help other people. And I think that's it's just marvelous, really.
It is. Yeah. And, I've always found that the people that have the personal connection to the plant or to the industry, however you want to describe it, there seems to be a little bit more good intention behind that. Not that people don't have good intentions. I mean, building a business and, creating jobs for people, those are well-intentioned efforts. But when there's a story where you saw somebody firsthand, life impacted and changed by the use of this plant, it's pretty impactful, and you can never lose that. And frankly, that's the I don't know what you would even call that, but it's that notion. That's what's going to help us sort of free the plant, if you will. Create these commercial systems all around the world, because when people see firsthand, people with no cannabis experience at all, how it helps people with any number of conditions, it's unmistakable. You can't ever forget that.
No, massively. I mean, there's lots of people at the moment kind of campaigning in the UK and trying to push the notion of anecdotal evidence as a really powerful thing. Everyone always wants double-blind trials and things like that to prove things, and of course that's valid. But aggregated anecdotal evidence is still a big body of evidence, and particularly from a campaigning perspective and a point of view perspective, it's much more powerful than a statistic. A story about someone's mother or someone's child or someone's brother or sister is always going to be more powerful when it comes to making change. Now, you've probably seen everything change quite a lot, since you started your law firm or even before then. What do you think some of the biggest things that have kind of driven that change have been? There's obviously a passion for the plant, in the population in the US, but what are some of the things that have really helped it find traction and catalyze?
Well, fun consumer behavior around cannabis when there was strictly an illicit market in the US. I guess it's all technically illicit because it's still federally illegal, but that's another story for another day. But a non-commercial marketplace, right? The people that we would always go to on the corner or our friends. Those days really didn't develop consumer preferences, right? There was a form of the product that you purchased. Sometimes it was more concentrated than others. You smoked it, or if you were in certain areas, there were concentrates available. But to see how consumer product development has taken place is really fascinating. And again, what better place to do that than in the United States, where consumer preference sort of dictates everything. And I think that's the difference maker. While a tried and true veteran cannabis user might say, the guy that I've known for 30 years produces the best flower. That person still can't deny that when you walk into a dispensary, for lack of a better way to put it, and to have that wide variety of products of all concentrations, of all forms of delivery, light and heavy, you name it, I think that's pretty remarkable. And I think, not that I'm surprised it happened so fast, but I'm surprised that it's taken so long, that the black market, or the illicit market, if you will, was not as innovative or creative. They didn't need to be, but I think that's one of the things that drives it. The globalization of the topic is something that I think about a lot, and have devoted the better part of the last 4 to 5 years of my life is working on international transactions and international policy development, because in the U.S. we kind of we don't take cannabis policy change head on. We like to nip around the edges. Oh, the states can do this, and maybe the federal government can't enforce over here. But we haven't seen real meaningful discussion about legalization really until this Biden administration. We see a lot of talk from the politicians on both sides of the aisle, and it's a foregone conclusion in my mind. What will happen if you legalize cannabis? It will create a tremendous economic boom that will last for years, if not beyond. We saw what happened in Canada when those markets opened up. So I think the globalization is important, but every country, every jurisdiction legalizes cannabis for a different reason. There's not one size fits all. Sometimes it's criminal justice reform. Sometimes it's purely medicinal. Sometimes it's to create jobs and economic growth. Those are just a few of the reasons that cannabis policy changes happen so fast. But it really surprises me because, there's countries all over. Think of the Latin American nations that have legalized it. And, with their history of the narco trade, of course, created by U.S. drug policy, which was pretty bad policy that affected millions and millions of people's lives over a long period of time. And it still exists, of course. But now you've got these very conservative Catholic narco-historical locations legalizing cannabis. Colombia's legislature just the other day passed a piece of legislation to move for domestic distribution. So all of that is fascinating to me, and that's why I do it, and that's why our team does this, to tackle new and novel issues every day if we can.
There's certainly plenty of them around the globe. I think that's a really interesting point. I never really thought about that particular thing in my head, that every country has a different reason for doing it. Some are motivated by the economics, some are motivated by care, or they have a drug problem, like a Portugal with decriminalization years ago, or Uruguay, something like that. And then you've got Thailand that just have had cannabis be a part medicinally of their culture for a long time, and they've just gone, okay, well, just crack on, and we'll take a very pragmatic approach and not try and police it too much and not try to make money off it. And then other countries do the opposite, and they're all valid reasons. And the fact that they're being explored, I think, helps other countries. Is that domino effect, isn't it? When one starts doing it in a region, it has wider implications. Thailand have done it, so Malaysia are interested. Germany are doing it, so the Czech.
Jimmy, that's a great point, though. So if you had to speculate, and of course none of us presumably have been in the rooms with the German decision makers, but what do you think the German rationale for pushing this is? To me, I think it's part of this German mentality that we're going to think this through in the most deliberate way, and we have the best chance to create the most sound model legislation for the world. I think there's a lot of that going on in there, and that's a whole different reason, and I can't disagree with that, and hopefully that gets to the finish line.
No, absolutely. I think so. Sorry, man.
No, I think I think they're being very pragmatic about it. They have a multi kind of party government at the moment, so they have a lot of different pull from a lot of different directions, and I think they're just looking at it and go, well, all these people are already doing it illegally, let's just do it right. Like that's very much the German approach. Let's just do it properly. If we're going to do it, let's do it properly. and kind of hash it out from there. And it's interesting to see it grow. And yeah, there's no question it's going to happen, and probably in the next sort of year and a half or so, I would have thought. But yeah. We'll see.
And it's interesting how it feels like you get the impression it's going to be much more robust, perhaps, than other markets that have kind of embraced legalization sort of from a recreational perspective. And I think they have the opportunity to kind of look at what's happened in different states and in different countries where legalization has happened. And it's not sort of pick and choose, but it's almost like learn. And I think, again, that's the sort of continuous feedback, isn't it? But I think, again, what I think we both find quite admirable about the US is that, you're actually sort of doing it. There may be mistakes along the way, but, it's happening. There's momentum there. And I think that's more than can be said for a lot of places, including the UK. I mean, we have a medical market, but no one knows about it. It's that sort of thing. Right.
But I would say, though, I've worked for well over 30 countries around the globe in pretty intimate settings. And what you just said, I think it's an important thing. The fact that we can learn from what's happening in all these jurisdictions around the world. As an American, I come to the table. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm here to tell you what mistakes we've made and how we can try to avoid those. And, if you work in the industry long enough, they say every year is like 7 years, like a dog, right? Yeah. So you've seen everything, but also I think it's that notion that the patterns are repeatable. So, with a high degree of certainty, I can come to the table and tell you what's going to happen next and next and next, not because I can predict the future, but because I've seen these patterns evolve in other jurisdictions. And, maybe there's an option to do it a little bit differently and see how that works. So that's kind of the novel element to all of this is it's drug policy on a world stage. And, even the United Nations seems to be moving towards revisions. The late 2020, the UN reclassified medical cannabis, or perhaps classified medical cannabis in a way that was different from marijuana for the first time, and that's a significant move there. So moving towards that, looking at how plant-based medicines around the world can be more accessible to people, and sort of hopefully the byproduct of that is moving away from a strictly pharmaceutical model. I mean, there's so many implications and repercussions for what we're doing. And again, that's what makes it all exciting. That's why we wake up with a smile on our face every day, guys.
Absolutely. I was going to say what? Sorry.
No, I think that vein of excitement is just built around. It's a constant exploration. It's Wild West sort of development right in front of you, and you can see it developing, as you say, at the same rate at different points in time. You say this country's here and this country's here, that country will be there in a couple of years, and you can follow it all the way through, and it's observable really in real time, which is really interesting. I don't know if it's a put you on the spot question, but it's interesting. There's lots of different policy around the world that people criticize, particularly things like different tax policies that really hurt the industry and growers and dispensaries, every business involved, really. Is there anywhere that's done it really well, do you think? And if you had, I kind of wrote it down in our brief beforehand, if you had a magic wand and you were going to wave it, what would be some of the things that you would put in place that you think would make a market sustainable and successful and be good for customers and consumers and patients? And it's unbelievably complicated, but yeah, it is. What are some of the things that you might look to do?
So I kind of divide things when I look at a program or a jurisdiction. I kind of divide things into two different elements of the business. One is sort of global participation, or what I'd call supply chain, mostly exportation. Then I'd say, what does a domestic marketplace look like? So I think that through trial and error, the Canadians, the Dutch, the Germans, several of the Latin American countries, Colombia in particular, they've demonstrated the desire to participate in this global supply chain. I look at a place like Colombia. You really can't think of a Latin American nation that's more torn with the history of the narco trade than Colombia. And they went into this with their eyes open with an export-only model. And that model initially didn't allow for the exportation of flower, for example. But they were able to change their regulations on a number of occasions, most recently under the former President Duque, to allow for flower to be exported. So in other words, the government is understanding in real time what the global supply chain needs, what is holding back the Colombian production side of the global industry, for example. And they identified those problems in a number of ways, but the most obvious one is the allow for the exportations of flower. So then all of a sudden you have someone competing with Canadian exported flower, which is very, very high cost, very, very highly regulated. And not that the Colombian product isn't as regulated, but it can be grown outside, outdoors, and at a much lower cost. So, for example, that changed things dramatically. And so I think the ability to change the regulations when they need to be changed is something we've learned from a place like Colombia. That's still not a successful export market yet. It's getting there, but it's a leader in my mind because of the fact that they've changed their regulations and adapted to the market in real time, which means they're paying attention to the market. Some countries just put regulations in place and say, go do it, and then it's up to the private market. And the private market should lead the way, no doubt about it, but the government needs to be nimble and make changes. Now, when you look at the other side, that domestic distribution side, I think some of the state models in the U.S. are the best models. And of course, a model that I'm very proud of and have worked in quite a bit for 12, 13 years now is the Colorado model. It's about as simple and straightforward as a distribution model as possible. The taxes are included. There's a dispensary system. It's a closed loop production system, and it doesn't allow for interstate commerce. I think that model has formed the basis for a number of other states across the U.S. It's also the basis in many ways for what the Colombians are about to do and what the Germans will do with their distribution systems, et cetera. So I think that the simpler the model, the more effective it can be. And then using technology to give policymakers and your average citizen the idea, the understanding that what's happening is all tracked by the government and legitimate with the track and trace or seed to sale tracking systems. Those are good use of technology. But I also have to say, guys, I don't know if we know what the ultimate regulatory model is for a domestic distribution system. Because in the U.S., I know you've seen it in other places, but in the U.S., we have hemp-derived intoxicating compounds in the marketplace, like Delta-9, Delta-8, Delta-10, HHC, a number of other compounds. I was recently in Europe. These products are being sold all over Europe as well. They're being sold in bodegas in Colombia and many other places across Latin America. So does that present a product to a different consumer that will not use marijuana from a dispensary? The answer, I'm told from my clients, is yes. It's a very different consumer. So they don't want to walk into a dispensary. They don't want highly concentrated products. They want something that's a little bit lighter, a little bit less impactful, to have a relaxation and a high, but not something that an average everyday cannabis user might want. So I think that we don't really know what the merged model will look like in the future. And this debate's going on state by state around the U.S. right now. And we don't really know where it's going to go. Maybe it's overtaxed. Maybe it's overregulated, which means that the cost is too high to produce these materials. And as we've seen, at least in the U.S., prices are down in the between $130 to $170 a pound in the U.S. on the regulated market, when the illicit market can still sell it for thousands of dollars per pound. So my point to you is there's a lot of things we need to learn. I don't know what the ultimate market is, but I think that if you view it through those two lenses, international supply chain and domestic distribution, there's really, really good models there, but you still have to kind of figure out your own way.
And I guess it links back into, again, the individual country. What's their reason for doing it? What's the culture of the people? What's the attitude to cannabis? There are so many things that impact its success internally, that are going to, deem whether or not it works. There was the German leak where they set out potential regulations that would be released. They kind of did it as a bit of a water test. So what does the industry really think about what we're doing?
Yeah. And a week later, it's like,
okay,
by the way, what we said,
we got that wrong. We can learn from that, and that's I think that impacts. The perfect answer is, as you say, there is probably not a perfect model, but there is the ability to be agile and to respond to changes, whether that is in the cost of production or the cost of regulation, anything like that. And it's legislation that keeps pace with an industry, which is something legislation typically struggles with.
Yeah. And think about the European countries. Again, everything, as you guys well know, everything's so close together. And you have to understand that if you're a country that's going to participate and other countries are already participating, you have to distinguish yourself from them. So if you have an ideal model for domestic distribution of adult use in Germany, so then what are the surrounding countries going to do? What's going to set Czech Republic apart from Germany? Yes. What's going to set Spain apart? Is it the fact that they're going to be more advanced with their clubs and the the distribution model and the social consumption model? But that's another interesting thing is social consumption has been tolerated in so many places across Europe. Of course, the famous coffee shops in the Netherlands. I was just there several weeks ago with many of the longest operating coffee shop owners in the country. And these guys have been doing it for 40 years. And they keep saying, well, what more of an experiment do you need? You see what we've been doing. I mean, the data's all there, right? But it's almost like they don't want to talk about the consumption and the domestic model. They want to talk more at a higher level. And that's an interesting development as well.
I was going to say, I mean, again, just put you on the spot slightly. Looking at the UK, I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, you're familiar with what's going on here and how things are shaken out. Just to be clear, what advice or what insights would you offer as a kind of to kind of increase awareness of sort of medical cannabis and potentially? I mean, I think. How do people feel about recreational cannabis? Again, jury's out, I think, but I think there's sufficient support overall. But it feels like what's happening here is particularly onerous, in terms of raising awareness. I mean, for example, the way in which, we have national health care here. But we also have private healthcare. People aren't used to paying more than £10 for a prescription. So the idea of going into an online dispensary, is paying £50 for a consultation, and then another £120 or something like that is probably for most people kind of out of reach. Or it's an expense that they go, well, that's a lot. But again, if you kind of go to find street cannabis, it's probably going to cost, for something good quality, similar amount. But it's that whole stigma around it. I mean, what do you think? I mean, again, if you can offer any insight or advice on, hey, UK policymakers, wake up, do this because we've seen it work here. I'm just curious more than anything else.
Sure. No, I mean, look, but to your point, fundamentally, that the biggest takeaway is education. Everyone needs education. And we were where we started with this, personal stories, seeing people benefit from the plant, people that are not a stereotype, people that can actually help with a variety of conditions, seeing it in real time, that'll change people's mind. But, I think that we have a bit of a misnomer, so to speak, right? So I separate cannabis programs into four distinct categories. And these categories already have regulatory models. So the first one is industrial uses. Okay, that speaks for itself. The second category would be pharmaceutical, meaning this is truly medical marijuana. I'm not saying it's better or it's more effective. In fact, I don't think it is, because it's usually based on synthetic compounds. However, that's a model that I think that the mainstream patient base will access instead of going to access flower or natural compounds. So that's the second lane. That typically involves, an FDA type agency to approve the compound almost exclusively. The third, I call it wellness products or natural products, meaning non-intoxicating compounds from hemp. CBN, CBD, CBG, even nutritional products, omega-6s, proteins, any way you consume the product and don't produce some sort of high, that's sold over the counter. And then I've got the last category, which is a big category, OTC cannabis, over-the-counter marijuana. What do I mean by that? I mean, that's the dispensary system. And I don't want to make light of this, but there's really no difference between adult use and medical marijuana. It just simply qualifies the purchaser. How does the purchaser qualify to buy the product? If I go to a medical marijuana store, I have to be a certain age and have a doctor's recommendation, but I'm still buying the same thing over the counter. Is it medicine? Of course, the scientific studies support that it's medicine, but that's not medicine in the way that governments and your mainstream population understand it, which is why I separate that other category. This is the biggest challenge I see in Europe, because aside from the Germans and maybe the people in Czech Republic, I don't see a lot of discussion about adult use cannabis. It's more comfortable to talk about medical cannabis. But then you're sending a wrong message to patients that say that, if you're an 80-year-old person that could benefit from cannabis, do you really think you can teach an 80-year-old person to smoke marijuana? I mean, sometimes yes, but it's not natural to say, this is your medicine, you consume it this way, or it makes you feel this way. Sometimes those people will be more comfortable with an FDA approved, that second lane, that pharmaceutical approved lane. So I guess my point is, I think that the medical designation in Europe, across Europe, is more confusing, and I think it holds us back from the real discussion, which is over-the-counter marijuana. Whether I buy it for medical use or because I want to have fun, it should not matter, because it's the exact same product I'm buying over the counter, and it's taxed. So that's not always a popular position, but I do think that's the reality of it. So moving away and instead of making less of a distinction between medical cannabis and adult use, it's all over-the-counter marijuana, and understanding that medical use through the pharmaceutical channels is going to develop differently. And I don't think that most people in the future are going to access their medical cannabis by consuming it through smoking or vaping or even eating it. I think they're going to get pills. And that's just the way our world's developed. I'm not saying that's good, but that's why I think that there's a lot of confusion. And, I work for a small country between France and Spain in the mountains, and that distinction has really puzzled them.
Okay, now, right? Is it Andorra?
It might be. It might be.
Okay, maybe. Okay, I may have heard of it. Yeah. Okay.
So my point to you is they have about 10 million tourists per year. Okay. For a variety of reasons. So how do you make medical cannabis available to tourists? Well, in that case, it's really not medical, though, is it? Because, maybe if I fall on the ski slopes and hurt myself, that's medical cannabis. Or if I have a prescription I come in with, that's medical cannabis. But otherwise, I'm trying to make allowances for people to purchase it to say that it's medical when it's really just over-the-counter marijuana. So those are the challenges that people need to understand, and policymakers don't understand this. And then the patient community, they want access so much for their patients, rightfully so. But what does access mean? Access to what? Access to flower, access to oil, or access to medication? We don't know how that's going to evolve over time. And it's going to evolve in a way that I don't think we're all going to be happy with, unfortunately.
These, again, as you rightly point out, these are the kind of inherent issues. And we've spoken to people before, and it's kind of, doctors don't want to prescribe stuff called, ghost train haze or pink kush or whatever. It feels green wrong to exactly. It feels wrong to them. And, again, because I guess, as you sort of say, education is so crucial, but it doesn't kind of exist for them on cannabis in the same way that it has for other pharmaceuticals. And so it's almost, there's that kind of disparity between that and the kind of what, the cannabis consumer from a recreational. And it's kind of like, well, it's the consumer understanding of what the plant can do and whether it's therapeutic or whether it's, recreational. It's all therapeutic. That's the thing. And it's that whole distinction or lack of a distinction, or understanding where the plant comes from and what it can do and what the components can do and what, it's a big ask for a lot of people, isn't it? Unless you're really, really keen to understand it, it's like, like you say, 80-year-old person is not going to just turn around and start, rolling up a joint and sort of saying, or they might, but at the same time, exactly. So it's a whole, trying to get that sort of clarity when something is quite complex. And look in the UK, right? You've got what's happening in Jersey, and so that
confuses the discussion a little bit more, right?
Yes.
Is this really medicine, or are we saying it's medicine so it can be this? Again, this is the way it's evolved from the medical program everywhere, but it makes it harder, a lot harder.
At least when people talk about this kind of Trojan horse approach, it's kind of like, let's bring it in with medical, and then they've got recreational sort of waiting in the belly of the big wooden horse or whatever. And it's kind of like, well, I get that, and I understand that that's a thing, but it's almost like, why can't we just sort of come out and straightforward and say, hey, let's just make the whole thing accessible for everyone, and, you know, give people the advice they need when choosing what's right for them. And I feel like that would be the good way forward, but that feels like too big a sort of leap for a lot of places, particularly kind of lawmakers. That's just my perception. I don't know if that's something.
I think you're right. I think that government actors somehow are wired to believe that the government needs to tell the people what's good and what's not, what's available and what's not. And I'm not so sure that people are always capable of making those decisions on their own without some guidance from somewhere, whether that's physician community or the government. That's surprising to me, but I think that that's more mainstream than we'd like to admit.
No, absolutely. Just to kind of wrap things up, I just wanted to ask again, what are you looking forward to in 2023? What sort of big shifts do you think we might see? I mean, I'm not going to say, hey, federal legalization in the US. I mean, that'd be great, but it feels like a long way away. But what do you think we'll see in 2023 for the cannabis community?
I mean, there's so many debates. So I'm interested to see how the United Nations debate evolves, because of course there was the vote from the committee in November of 2020. How does that get translated into writing as recommendations for the signatory nations? How does Germany and or the Czech Republic deal with the UN before they finish their program and enact that program? How does the European courts of justice, how do they interpret this? And does that stop the program from moving forward? How does domestic distribution evolve in certain Latin American countries? Is that something that will be embraced, or is that something that they'll look at and say that this costs too much, it's overtaxed, this is for maybe tourists only, or medical tourism only? So those are a few of those things, but there's a topic that is subject to much debate in the U.S. around safe banking and access to the capital or the public markets. And there was a discussion that maybe that was going to get rolled into end of year legislation. It did not. There's also speculation that it could be a standalone bill now that would give banking and capital markets access. They say that the votes are there in the Senate, but it remains to be seen whether the politicians will want to put this out there and do it. That will be a game changer if that happens, because, like I said, look what happened in Canada. You have the Toronto Exchange and the Canadian Securities Exchange. Those exchanges have historically serviced emerging markets or the mining industry, things that came out of nowhere very, very quickly and raised a bunch of money. And the cannabis industry benefited from that. But if you opened up the U.S., the markets, the NASDAQ and or the New York Stock Exchange, we would see investment even during an economic downturn that was unprecedented. So the question is, what political party in the U.S. wants to take credit for that? That's really the question. And that could be a game changer, unless, of course, does the Frankfurt market open up in a similar way when the Germans passed this? Are there, we've always talked about the London Exchange. Is that something that would open up with a few simple changes to bringing dollars in? Those are the things that I look out for 2023. And last is this continuing debate about intoxicating compounds derived from the hemp plant, because that has a major bearing, as we've talked about, on what's the future regulatory structure look like. Is it all intoxicating compounds from cannabis go through one distribution outlet, or does it get relaxed? Like alcohol sales, where you can buy alcohol in many countries in convenience stores and grocery stores, and it's not strictly regulated. So those are the debates that I watch for 2023, and excited to be a part of it, and excited to see you guys on the road.
Absolutely.
Lots of exciting travel ahead, and lots of changes.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for your insight and for answering our all good questions. And well, we'll speak to you soon, Bob. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, gentlemen. My pleasure.